Oh, just got a message pop up here. So you could imagine that writing a book about food co-ops would compel me to be paying attention to the impacts food co-ops have had on the dominant food system and on food in general. And so there was this instance earlier this year that was one of many that I want to share with you just as an opening that made me really realize the impact and influence co-ops have had, specifically the co-ops of the previous 50 years, co-ops like yours and the co-op I'm a part of here in British Columbia that emerged in the 1970s. And so earlier this year, I was on a little road trip, and I was about 3 hours out of Nelson, where I live, driving through another city. And it's a city that has a lot of fast food chains, and I don't have very many here in Nelson. And so, I kind of notice these things in a different way because I'm in a bit of a bubble, probably not so dissimilar to where you are in Traverse City, smaller communities. But, I'm driving through this larger city, and I saw 3 different fast food restaurants in the span of 30 seconds. And it was the secondary signs underneath these larger fast food signs that really struck me. And I'll just share what I saw. Again, this is in the span of probably not even 20 seconds. So the first sign I saw was the KFC sign. And underneath the KFC sign was another sign that said plant-based meat. So that certainly struck me. Never would have I imagined, 10, 15 years ago that I would see that underneath a KFC sign. The next business after KFC was an A&W, and underneath the A&W sign was grass-fed beef. And then right across the street from A&W was a McDonald's, and underneath the McDonald's sign was a sign that said locally owned, community driven. And of course, it struck me that this is the language that food co-ops have been using for the past 50 years, and certainly over the past 20 years in particular, at the advent of what might be considered the more modern local food movement. And this is the language that co-ops have really helped pioneer. And this has now become the language of the dominant food system. And so, this was just one of many moments that I've now really been paying attention to that really showed that the efforts of our food co-ops from the 1970s have made a huge impact on how food is understood, how it's grown, how it's distributed, how it's consumed. That famous quote from Margaret Mead that never doubt that a small group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's all that ever has, is, I believe, absolutely true in the case of food co-ops. And so, from my co-op from the 1970s to your co-op, let's pat each other on the back for having done, I think, such a great job. And of course, we didn't do it alone. There were natural food stores that were supporting that as well. Companies like Whole Foods have had an impact, no question. And, one of the things too that came up today in my history session with your management team was looking back at the history of the United States, in particular, how at one time in the country's history, there were fair trade laws, domestic fair trade laws that protected the prices that manufacturers were selling their product at. Those are no longer. However, there was this really this human spirit that emerged, particularly in this case, post-Depression era, where the prices that producers and manufacturers, farmers needed to make a living was protected. And of course, co-ops have been a huge influence in maintaining those ideals, and of course, introducing what has now become the more dominant language of fair trade, which is often referring to products that are coming from overseas, like coffee and chocolate. And of course, that's being broadened now into produce and other foods. And of course, food co-ops have played a role there. And so looking back at that history of how these values used to exist in the country, at least from a political level, it really shows how co-ops have really been that anchor of the human spirit, of that humanity that can live through our food system. And so, how does this look visually? I just want to share some examples, some of what I saw on my trip. And of course, I'm sure you have all seen in your recent shopping experiences too. So just give me a second while I pull up my screen here. So here's some examples of what is now emerging in the dominant food system thanks to the work of food co-ops. So this is an image from a Walmart. And the language of organic, the actual space dedicated to organic, of course, has increased. This again is a considerable result of the role that food co-ops have had in changing the conversation and raising awareness. This is a sign from inside of a Safeway in Washington State. Signs like local, again, something that has been very common in food co-ops is now emerging in the dominant food system in some of the largest grocery chains across the country. This is back in a Walmart in North Carolina, almost produce section length sign that says grown close to home, look for local. Here in Nelson, we have a few different large grocers, one of them Safeway, and this is the flyer from a recent Safeway flyer that went out, look for local. This is the display inside of that Safeway, right when you walk in, look for local. So this is front and center in the largest grocery chains here in Canada as well. This one is Harris Teeter, a Kroger-owned chain in the Eastern US. And you can see what, this is a very common practice in food co-ops of putting up photos of the farmers. This is now happening in the largest chains in the country. This was a recent announcement from Loblaw. They started announcing this pilot program. This is here in Canada, Canada's largest grocer, piloting a program to introduce reusable packaging with food manufacturers. So again, this is something co-ops have been doing for many decades, starting that conversation and of course, manifesting it in the store. And co-ops, historically were the hubs and epicenters of the conversations around so many social, environmental, and political issues. And the conversations for all of these issues that you see here were initiated in many cases through the space that co-ops had created and through the actions of co-ops and through the leaflets that people would hand out at co-ops and the bulletin boards at co-ops. Again, this has been one of the roles co-ops have played. So, co-ops are immensely powerful. Even the conversations around recycling and animal welfare, pollution, plastic bags, a lot of this, again, was generated through co-ops. So co-ops have played this pioneering role in raising awareness. And in my view, particularly over the past year and a half now, we have, over the past year and a half, we've been shown a vulnerability within the food system. So we have, instances like this. Even in my co-op today, you can walk in and there's sections of my co-op that certainly don't look like this, but there's sections of food that have been empty for periods of time. And of course, this is something that most of us would have witnessed about a year and a half ago. And so more than ever before, people are paying attention to grocery stores, which of course, for me, despite all the challenges this has brought, has been a welcome sign because grocery stores, I think, play a much more substantial role than many of us give them credit for. And so I just want to outline 4 areas. This is something I would have shared when I went on my book tour back in 2019 as part of my talk. And I just want to share it again. When we walk into a grocery store, we generally, and I'm not so much referring to those of us in this room, because clearly as members of your co-op and me as a co-op member, I'm speaking of that larger we. But when folks walk into grocery stores, often the relationship is one of transaction, of exchange. This is a business selling food. We have a budget, we walk in and we buy our food, but there's so much more happening in these spaces. And so 4 key areas of impact that I think have really, that really do emerge out of grocery stores. The first, of course, is health. As far as I'm concerned, grocery stores play a larger role in human health than even the healthcare system. You can look at incidence of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, even mental health. All of it can be traced back to the food that we eat. So, grocery stores are generators of either good or poor health. The environmental impact of grocery stores is also considerable. We know that a minimum of 25% of greenhouse gases emerge out of the food system, 6% of greenhouse gases out of food waste. And so when grocery stores are the primary point where we as eaters access food, again, these spaces, these buildings have literally an earth-shaping effect. Economics, of course, this is a huge role that co-ops play or grocery stores play as well. And we really saw this a year and a half ago at the beginning of the pandemic, where the only businesses, some of the only businesses open were grocery stores. And this is, of course, because of how essential they are to both the global economy, our health, and the local economy. And so, there's so many different businesses that rely on grocery stores for their economic well-being. And then, of course, there's the impact the grocery store has on the food system. And this goes without saying. And one of the ways I describe it in my book is using this analogy of a bottleneck, of a series of bottlenecks, where you have 500 million people on the planet growing food, approaching 8 billion of us eaters. And there are these series of bottlenecks that all of that food has to go through. And so I call the grocery stores gatekeepers, because they really are determining which foods make it to market and which foods don't. So again, this is a huge power on determining the future of food that these grocers have, that any grocery store has. Another bottleneck that isn't on this would be distribution as well, which is also very similarly concentrated, as you can see in what these numbers describe, usually how many businesses are controlling any one part of the food chain here. So generally in one area, you're going to have no more than 5 grocers dominating that marketplace. So again, when we see these grocery stores in our community, or anywhere we go, it's not fair to just look at them as being businesses selling food. These are, again, are substantial, earth-shaping institutions that have an impact on our health, an impact on our economy. They determine the future of food. And when most folks are accessing their food, certainly those who are lucky enough to buy food, we're doing it through grocery stores. And so this is what got me as inspired and excited about the importance of food co-ops, because I can tell you, I was on the board of my co-op for 10 years, and it didn't sink in right away. It almost took that 10 years of being on my board to finally realize just how important this model of grocery store ownership is, in part because it really protects the ownership of the store for a number of reasons. And because of the role these grocery stores play, of course, by owning our store, we can have more say in the impact that our grocery store has in these areas of health, environment, economics, and food systems. So it was this excitement that compelled me to, after I left the board of my co-op, to write a book about food co-ops, because there really weren't many out there, if any at all. There was one written in the early 1970s and another that emerged in about 2012, 2013. So I launched a Kickstarter campaign and raised some other funds through sponsors as well. This would have been back in 2018, late 2017. And eventually, this was the first box of printed books that arrived at my door. And so again, this would have been in 2019 now. And it was through the fundraising and through the sponsorship that came through, Oriana being also one of the sponsors that helped support my book tour, I was able to go out and buy a van specifically for this trip. So not something you would imagine most authors would go and do, go on a book tour in a van. But in my case, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to not only, of course, use this van to travel, but I wanted to send a message as I was driving across the country. And I wanted anybody who was going to be behind my van to be presented with this question: who owns your grocery store? So I ended up visiting 125 food co-ops, traveled across 34 states, 2 provinces, and I also sat down with about 23 startups and spoke at events that they hosted. So these are groups trying to form food co-ops. And to give you a view of what that extensive book tour looked like, here it is. And you can see there, October 26th, exactly 2 years ago today, I was in Traverse City. So coincidental that here I am again, virtually 2 years later, or not. And you know what, of course, if you're traveling across the country visiting food co-ops, one of the natural things I had to put together was a food co-op directory. And so this is now a directory that's on my website for my book. And this gives you a sense of where food co-ops are today. It's a heat map that shows where co-ops are concentrated. You can see there in the north of Michigan, where you are, quite a few co-ops. And this is a more traditional map that I traced my route on. And the red line is the spring tour, and the black line is my fall tour. And just to prove I was there, for those of you that didn't come to my event, here is me, at least my van in front of your co-op. And one of my favorite photos I took on the road was this one here, where it almost looks like you could drive your small van into the back of mine. And I got to say, there aren't many food co-ops that have their own vehicles. So I was pleasantly surprised when I saw this one. And this is me inside your co-op with Devin, and there's me giving a talk. You might recognize that slide there, which I was using a couple years ago. And so, here's just a glimpse in a few slides of all of the food co-ops I visited. And of course, I can't fit them all on here, but you're about to see many more. I went to the annual food co-op conference and spoke there. I spoke at other events, schools. I was down at Michigan State University speaking at a class there that's taught by Phil Howard, who's a well-known, food policy advocate. So the co-op that was the furthest east that I visited was a 1970s co-op, and the first slides I want to share with you here are 1970s co-ops, like yours and like mine. This co-op, Rising Tide, is in Damariscotta, Maine, and so this was the furthest east that I went. And co-ops are evolving. So one of the co-ops that really exemplifies this is Outpost in Milwaukee. So Outpost was a 1970 co-op. It was one of the first, of the 1970s that really established itself. At one point, this co-op was open 24 hours a day because when it started, it was also a place to hang out. And it has now grown into a 4-store co-op. And the impact that this co-op has in the Milwaukee area is substantial. I get into it in my book. I'm not going to get too into here, but this is a co-op that employs 500 people. They have 23,000 owners. And they own a few different trucks, in part because out of one of these stores, out of these locations, they're producing, prepared foods for the other stores. And so, in a way, co-ops today are vertically integrating by producing some of the food that, in often cases, are foods that they can't get in the quality they want, or the values aren't aligned. And so they create these foods themselves. And so Outpost is, one of these superhero co-ops in that sense. The Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op, they moved into this space in 2016. This is also a co-op that started in 1972. This is one of the largest co-ops in terms of sales of any co-op in the country. They do over $50 million in sales. And this was one of the busiest co-ops I went into, and just a beautiful space that incorporates, local artists into the design, and, huge store located pretty close to the downtown in Sacramento. This is their produce department. And this was the only co-op I came across that had a multi-story parking garage, which I felt I needed to take a picture of because parking at co-ops is like a notoriously difficult thing to do. It seems to be something that plagues co-ops everywhere, including my own, the availability of parking. And so when I saw this, I certainly laughed, because as a board director of my co-op, it was certainly a hot topic, parking. The Hendersonville Community Co-op in North Carolina, 1978. This started as a buying club, like many food co-ops. In their case, it was 15 families that started this co-op, and in 2016 moved into this beautiful new space. In Brattleboro, Vermont, a 1975 co-op, they moved into this space in 2012 and partnered with a local housing trust to build 24 affordable housing units on top of the store. So this was one of the first co-ops that actually was involved in a development like this. In Duluth, Minnesota, starting to be closer into your area, into your region. Duluth, again, a co-op that started in the 1970s. Whole Foods Co-op traces their roots back to 1970. They opened up this second store in the west end of the city in 2016. And this is what it looks like inside the store. Another co-op that I didn't visit, and so, being in the role that I am around my food co-op work, I also pay attention to what's going on elsewhere. And so I wasn't able to make it to Kansas, but in Lawrenceville, Kansas is this co-op from 1974, started as a buying club. And last year, they opened a second store, and it's a unique story because it's a store that carries a blend of conventional food and what would be more stereotypically cooperative food, organic, natural, local foods. So this is their store in Lawrenceville, and this is the second location they opened up last year in Kansas City. And Kansas City had been, and still is to a degree, plagued by what the USDA defines as food deserts. So areas of a city without any grocery store whatsoever. It's defined by how far the residents live from the store. And so the city, Kansas City, worked with the Merck to open up a location in what was a food desert. And so they worked with the community by asking residents what they would want to see on the shelves of the store. And so, they opened up a store, and you can see here some recognizable brands that, give folks a familiarity when they walk into the store, as well as introduce them to some of those other foods that might be healthier and more natural. And so, this is something that is happening across the country with quite a few food co-ops. This is not an isolated story. And it's an amazing story because, in this case, the municipality funded the building of the store. So the Merck actually pays utilities and property taxes, but the store was capitalized through, the work of the municipality. In Minneapolis, which is one of the hotbeds, or you could say the hotbed of food co-op activity in the United States, the Seward Co-op, 1970s co-op, this is their first location, what was their first location until they opened this second store, which was a few years ago now. And they opened in an area that was very racially diverse. And their previous store didn't reflect, as far as their employees, the diversity of the area that the previous store was in. And so they really tried to fix that when they moved into this new area, and got a lot of attention for really breaking the diversity mold that many food co-ops sometimes struggle with. And so, they got attention in Civil Eats, which is one of the more well-known food publications online. And Seward Co-op is another one of these very powerful co-ops that has a huge influence on the region's food system. And they own this third building, which is an old creamery, where they have their administrative offices, a restaurant, a cafe, and this is where I gave my talk when I was touring through Minneapolis. And democracy at Seward Co-op is alive and well. This is how many people were running for the board when I was there in 2019. So 17 people running for the board. The Mississippi Market over in St. Paul, this is their third location. And People's Food Co-op in Rochester, Minnesota, a newer store here. This is the second store from the People's Food Co-op in La Crosse, Wisconsin, who merged with an existing 1970s co-op in Rochester and created this second store. Again, the only grocery store in the downtown center of Rochester. Common Market Co-op in Frederick, Maryland, very successful store. They saw an opportunity to move into a second location similar to yours, in that, in this case, a Safeway had closed, which is a very common occurrence now happening across the country with the least profitable grocery stores closing. In this case, Safeway had closed in an area of the city, and Common Market moved in and opened up their second location just recently. This is, they opened this after I was there. In Ithaca, New York, you have Green Star Natural Foods Market, which has 3 locations. And this is when I was there, I got to visit these, but just after I was there, they finished moving into a brand new store, which replaced their main store in Ithaca, New York there. In Great Barrington, Massachusetts, this is the original store on the left. And as I was there, they were building this mixed use development, or at least they were the anchor tenant of this mixed use development. And this is what the store looks like today. So, again, food co-ops are across the country recognizing the need to remain relevant in a very quickly changing marketplace, which I'm going to speak about shortly. and are doing that by, modernizing their stores, growing in size in order to, maintain a competitive edge in their market, but as well increase the impact that they're having in their communities. This is one that opened up last year that I didn't get a chance to visit either, but this one is in Astoria, Oregon, and one of the more beautiful design stores. And another co-op that really stood out that I did get to visit is this one here in Bozeman, Montana, the Community Food Co-op. And shortly before I got there, they had opened a second location in the downtown, a much smaller store that was much more focused on prepared foods, which of course is how many people are eating, more so than ever before, prepared, ready-to-eat meals. This is the reason why so many grocers and food co-ops are starting to get into this. And so they opened up a location that is very dedicated to focusing just on that, prepared meals and ready-to-eat food. So again, another example of a co-op adapting to changing eating habits and changing trends. And here you also have another example of something I think is representative of the possibilities that co-ops can enter into. Very few co-ops have done what Bozeman has done at the Community Food Co-op. So this area here was under development when I got there. Inside this new area attached to the store is one of the largest warehouses that I got to see at any food co-op. And so this is something you can see is very different within a food co-op versus any other grocery store. I'm guessing you don't see much of a warehouse like this at the Aldi in Traverse City. So this is something, that separates co-ops from the big grocers, is their, greater resilience of securing a supply chain, right? And of course, in this day and age, we're seeing the vulnerabilities of our supply chains. And so Bozeman is sort of being proactive in that sense, and they were being proactive because here we are now where I'm sure they're really benefiting from having such a large warehouse. You're seeing a small sliver of what that warehouse looks like. And on the right here, this is just a hallway within their commercial kitchen area where they're producing food for both locations as well as for other co-ops and even other stores, smaller stores in the region. And this is, inside their administrative offices. They have a dedicated bakery, as you see in the bottom right here, and more of the commercial kitchen there on the top right. So I really do think, this is one of the areas that food co-ops will be likely entering into, and I think rightfully so, as a way to secure the supply chain and be more resilient. In Grass Valley, California, this is Briar Patch. This is an incredible co-op that has 12,000 square feet and does about $35 million in sales out of 12,000 square feet. And they take that success and they invest it into really innovative projects like covering their parking lot with solar panels. And so another great story within the food co-op story is taking these profits that a co-op can make and reinvesting them back into these forward-thinking models that really do change the conversation, like I was sharing earlier, and show what's possible. And so their success is also translated into a second store, which they announced earlier this year. They're moving into this now vacant Kmart in Auburn, which is south of Grass Valley. And this next slide you're going to recognize. And I did not put this slide here because here I am speaking at Oriana Co-op virtually. This slide has actually been part of my presentation since the spring, and in part because what your co-op was when I was there was a real exemplary display of what a food co-op can become. I visited 125 food co-ops, and your co-op was really up there in probably the top 10 is as far as the feel of the energy in the store. I remember walking into the store and really having this experience of there's like an aliveness in this store, which is not the case in every food co-op I can tell you that I visited. And part of the story I share is, of course, this recent story of your second store opening, with a national chain, Lucky's, which really owes its expansion to Kroger, which invested heavily into the company. And this is a very common story of growing too fast and ending up in bankruptcy, which is what happened to Lucky's Market, as you know. And of course, here you are now in your second store. And so this is a story that I tell as part of my presentation to really show the importance of food co-ops in almost salvaging the remnants of the dominant food system. Because at the exact same time Lucky's Market went bankrupt, so did another large natural foods chain, Earth Fare, which had 51 stores, even more than Lucky's Market. And they've only been able to preserve about 20 of those stores. And so, this is happening where these stores are closing in communities. Of course, people are put out of work. And beyond that, there are also all of the suppliers that might have been relying on these stores and investing capital into their businesses to supply these stores, who all of a sudden lose a marketplace. And so, again, I like this story of your co-op being, there to, fill that space and, of course, increase your co-op's impact in your community. This is in Syracuse. This is one of the more interesting stores I visited, because this store has been in the exact same location since 1975. So 50 years in the same location. Almost 50 years. And just this year, they opened up a second location in this mixed-use development in what's modeled after a public market. And so they have a small space inside this is the downtown of Syracuse, New York, where again, not a single full-service grocery store in the area. This co-op has come in and now been able to fill that gap. One of the smallest co-ops I visited was Weaver's Way in Philadelphia. This is a really famous co-op, started again in the 1970s. This co-op is so small that they encourage folks to put their basket onto this counter and shop into the basket, because if you're walking around the store with your basket, you're taking up that much more space, which in a store of this size is really valuable. So this is why there's this counter here, is to put your basket. Their success in that tiny store enabled them to open a second location in 2015 in another part of the city. And they've also turned that success into the acquisition of 2 farms. So they own 2 farms, mostly within the city. One's right in the city. The other is a bit on the outskirts, but still urban. And they have a farm market. They operate a CSA. So, people will come in and pick up product at the CSA. Of course, the co-op also has a truck to move product around to their stores. This is a unique example, I should add, of a co-op owning a farm. It's certainly not common. And they opened a third location just before I got there in what was also a designated food desert in the north end of the city in Ambler. And they've recently announced a vision to open up a 4th location in the city. So this co-op has had a huge impact in the city and on the food system there, and on co-op culture as well in the city, and they're increasing that impact. The Moscow Food Co-op in Idaho opened up this second location, a very small, almost a kiosk on the campus of the University of Idaho, which was very unique, not something that a lot of co-ops have done, or any co-op has done. And this is what the space looks like. What you see is what it is right here. It's a counter with ready-to-eat foods, mostly coffee, and a real great way to sort of access and support students on campus. And another really new co-op, this one is in Fayetteville, Arkansas, if I'm pronouncing that properly. And another co-op that's really important to mention, because it's the last of its kind of any scale, and this is the Park Slope Food Co-op in Brooklyn. Probably one of the more recognized food co-ops, so much so that a lot of people, when they think food co-op, think of this co-op, because it's the one that seems to get the most amount of news. And this is a co-op that's maintained its participatory roots, where 75% of their labor needs have been fulfilled by their owners, who are required to work in the store. So you can't shop in the store unless you work just under 3 hours a month. And this has, for them, translated into considerable savings. And so this is a comparative shop that came out of a documentary about the co-op, where you can see, because they're saving so much in labor, the savings are substantial, 40% savings. Now, this is something that no longer is very prevalent across the country, in part because trying to manage this type of this level of volunteerism is very hard, and a lot of states' labor laws don't allow it. And so many co-ops that maybe maintain some of these programs really couldn't anymore, just legally. And as well, they're hard to maintain. But there's a few co-ops out there still maintaining optional programs. And the last co-op I want to share from the 1970s is my own, is where I live, and not so dissimilar to your area. We're quite isolated from any major urban center. Again, this is Nelson. We're just over 10,000 people, and we have 3 major grocery stores that our co-op competes with, and they're each owned by the 3 largest grocers in Western Canada. So we are not alone as a grocer, and we have strong competition. And so when I joined my board in 2006, our co-op was in this small space. We had about 5,000 square feet. We were doing about $7 million in sales. And so we were bursting at the seams. It was generally a really hard place to fill the shelves because they would empty and the staff would have to come right back out and fill them again. And so it wasn't a very efficient space to be operating. And we had certainly outgrown it. So for the 10 years I was on the board, we worked on finding another location. And we came across this one at the other end of the downtown, which was at the time operated by Canada's largest grocer. And the building and the land happened to be owned by a local family who decided, rather than renew the lease with Canada's largest grocer, they would instead sell the building to us. So we pulled together this vision, which we called Nelson Commons, and we built this mixed-use development, or proposed this mixed-use development. And sure enough, our members supported it through member loans. Credit unions came on board to support it. And we put up the first construction crane in Nelson's history. And part of what we were doing here was increasing the impact that our co-op was already having in the community. And I'm going to share some of those examples of that impact a little later. And so here's what the store looks like today. So we opened in late 2016. And so immediately we went from, in our previous location, we grew to selling $14 million of product a year. Very quickly, we were selling 23, then 24 million. And just this year, we were selling $26 million of product. And so that's translated into, impact, because in our case, our community is not growing. So we're capturing more and more of the grocery dollars in our community and reinvesting those back into our community. Again, I'm going to share some examples of how our co-op is doing that and how co-ops in general do that. One of the biggest impacts, of course, of growing in the way we did was employment. We became the largest privately owned employer in the city. So at one point we had 180 staff pre-pandemic. We now have about 140 to 150 staff. Paying wages of $5.4 million. This is our produce department. And we also were able to open up the co-op's first meat department, which prior to that, we were like a lot of co-ops that just had sort of a meat section in the store. In our case, it was a single meat cooler. And what this enabled us to do was support, at least a half a dozen right away new producers, and since then even more, who otherwise didn't have very easy access to their customers, to the market. And so, our growth has helped support all of these producers in the region, local producers who otherwise, weren't able to access the shelves. This is the prepared food section, which of course looks a bit different now because of COVID. And then this is the cafe. We built a 54-seat cafe, which has become a hub of connection, something unique too, that co-ops really stands out. I remember having an incredible lunch at your co-op and your cafe. Specifically, I do remember it. I'm not just saying that. I have highlights from my trip of things I remember eating, and one of them was being at your co-op. And our co-op has a huge commercial kitchen that we built. And so this has enabled us to prepare products that aren't being made locally, so we can't find local versions of everything. And so our co-op sort of fills that space rather than order in highly processed products from some cases across the border, or at least from 8 hours away in the Vancouver area. We're producing all of what you see here in the commercial kitchen. So similar to what I was sharing earlier from the Bozeman Co-op. So this is just a capturing of the 1970s co-ops and how they've evolved and the direction they're going. And I want to just share a few slides here of some of the co-ops that emerged from the Depression era, because there's still about a half dozen of them in the country. And one of them, Co-op Food Stores in New Hampshire and Vermont, is quite successful. One of the most successful co-ops. So this is a co-op that celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1961. And you can see their store in the background there. So these were co-ops that emerged at a time when, the capitalist system really collapsed. It collapsed, it caused the Great Depression, the stock market collapsed, and people began to see that, we needed a different system. And this explosion of co-ops emerged out of that era. And so today, this co-op has 4 locations spread out through 3 communities in Vermont and New Hampshire. This is a co-op that even has a gas station and a service station. And it's a co-op that is a blend of both conventional foods and organic foods. So it's a bit more resembling of a grocery store you might be more familiar with. And this is their teaching kitchen. This is one of the more impressive teaching kitchens I saw on my trip. Another Depression era co-op is a little younger than the Depression era. I mean, this one came out of mostly the fuel and food shortages of World War II. And so the Putney Food Co-op in Vermont emerged in that time to support its community. And this one is still going well, and in a beautiful little store that is really the community center for this region, which is just north of Brattleboro, Vermont. And just outside of Philadelphia in Swarthmore is this co-op that started as a buying club in 1932, eventually moved into a store in 1937, and is now the only grocery store pretty much in the entire center of Swarthmore. The closest grocery store to here is about 1.5 miles away. And because they're the only grocery store, when you walk into the store, once again, like some of these other co-ops I've described, you can see some more familiar brands that you're going to normally see in more of the conventional stores. But one of the things they do is they really try to place the more healthy or organic options or local options at eye level to encourage healthier eating. And this is also what the Seward Co-op in Minneapolis did in their new store. They put in some of these more familiar brands like Cheerios, but place them on the bottom shelf just to encourage, healthier eating. Because when you actually walk in and you look at the prices aren't any different. So it's really a matter of creating a familiar product for people to feel welcome, and then introducing these other options should people choose. And that other co-op I mentioned earlier in Rochester, Minnesota, they too, being the only grocery store, have it set up where you walk in and on the left is all conventional produce and on the right is organic. So this really is a reminder that co-ops are not synonymous with natural and organic foods. Co-ops are whatever the owners want it to be. And hopefully they're a co-op, they're a grocery store that responds to the needs of the community, because that's one of the principles of co-ops is concern for community. In the late 1990s into the early 2000s was a whole new wave of co-op development. And a lot of that came out of the local food movement, the effects of globalization, people recognizing the impacts of that, people starting to recognize the impacts of the food system on climate change and the environment. And so you started to see this wave of co-ops like this one in Portland, Maine, that emerged. And this one emerged in the shadows of what was at the time the largest Whole Foods in the country. The River Valley Co-op in Northampton, Massachusetts opened in 2008. They spent 10 years trying to get off the ground, and they did, and opened this huge store. They were so successful that a few years ago, they started announcing plans for a second location, which is what you see here as a model. And last year, they started building the store. And this year, they moved into their brand new store. And this is almost a finished store here that you see in the photo, covering almost the entire square footage of this parking lot and store with solar panels. And this is the opening day. In Littleton, New Hampshire, in this community of, I believe it's less than 10,000 people, smaller than where I live, this 20,000 square foot co-op now exists. And this was modeled after that Hanover co-op from the 1930s. And so that co-op from the 1930s worked very closely to help support the growth of this co-op, which has now, established itself as one of the main grocers in Littleton. And the impact that this store is having on workers, on local nonprofits is substantial. They really show this all around the store, the impact that they're having. So they opened their store and then were so successful that shortly after expanded with another 9,500 square feet. And again, you can see it's become an important gathering place in the community. And another important store that opened up, in this case, 1995, but they just renovated and moved into this store. This is in a town of 4,400 people in Viroqua, Wisconsin, very agricultural area. And they're doing 9.5 million in sales, which is, again, they're one of the main grocers in the community. And they are really the backbone of the region's food system. They work very closely with a food enterprise center right next door, which houses about 30 to 40 small scale food manufacturers. And they're able to bring that product into the store and support those producers. And so there's a community ecosystem that seems to have formed in Viroqua that's really unique. It's a story I focus a lot of attention on in my book. And these are some of those businesses operating next door in the food enterprise center. And so, again, a town of 4,400 people, this food co-op has really become the anchor for resilience in the region. And another emergence of food co-ops has been because there are many grocery store owners retiring, particularly, these smaller stores, in this case, the only grocery store in Cummington, Massachusetts. And so when the owners announced to the community that they were about to retire, the community came together and converted this privately owned grocery store into a co-op. And so this too is something that is starting to emerge because there is a growing instance of grocery store owners entering into retirement. And then the last area of food co-op development that I certainly got to see, I visited 23 different startups across the country who are in various stages of development. So near you, I visited Bay City, I visited Grand Rapids, where there are these efforts to build new food co-ops. And part of that is being helped by a new nonprofit that was formed, the Food Co-op Initiative, which was formed in 2005 to help support the growth of food co-ops. So here's one of the co-ops that was still being built when I went on my tour. And here's what it looks like today. So, this is a store that opened up earlier this year. One of the smaller co-ops out there, but really important co-op in an area of the city without any grocery stores. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, you have a food co-op that's now called Rooted Carrot. And so they, after I left, went and bought this piece of land and are now working towards developing that piece of land to build this store. Again, what would be and will be the only grocery store in the downtown of Cedar Falls. And another great success story this year was in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So this is another area of the city where there wasn't a grocery store because that particular one that they were renovating here had closed, and just this year opened up into their new space. So there's, activity happening all across the country. These are just some of the examples. Assabet Co-op Market in Maynard just announced a site location. Dorchester in the bottom left in Boston is under construction. In Detroit, a black-led food co-op, I'm sure one you've probably heard about because they've been working at this for a while. They're still in that sort of hopeful phase, but certainly have a lot of traction. And then in Lombard, Illinois is the Prairie Food Co-op, which is right now trying to raise funds to open up their store. And the role of food co-ops in supporting areas of the country that are without a grocery store, that are sometimes called food deserts. This is also another role that co-ops are stepping into. There's been some failed attempts, but here is so far a successful attempt in Dayton, Ohio, from this year. A Black-led co-op started with 3,000 founding owners, had this vision in 2015 to alleviate an area of the city with a population of about 19,000 people who were without a grocery store anywhere within 1.5 miles. And so this community came together and opened up not only a grocery store, but a teaching kitchen and a health clinic, which is located inside the store. So this is, again, more than just a grocery store. And that's often something, too, that separates co-ops from the big grocers, is that they're more than just a grocery store. They really are community centers. And one last example here is in Butte, Montana. So you have, again, like I mentioned earlier, all of these grocery stores across the country closing up shop, leaving areas of the city devoid of any grocery stores. This happened in Butte, Montana last year. 2 grocery stores closed within the span of a month. And at the first meeting to explore the possibility of a food co-op, you had 165 people show up. And there's a lot of energy right now to get that food co-op off the ground in Butte, Montana. So the food co-op movement is alive and well. It's growing. Here is just an example of where all the startups are located. This is representing about 85 different groups across the country who are trying to start food co-ops. And so, here I am with all of these photos, like many of the ones I just shared with you. And I recognized that, this was going to be an important tool to help support young co-ops in communicating to their communities what a food co-op is. So I came up with this idea for a publication called This Could Be Ours. I reached out to co-ops like yours to help sponsor it. And there you can see your co-op has helped support this, this publication. And it's 144 pages, 270 images from food co-ops across the US and Canada. And right now it's being used by startups all over the country at tables, when they're setting up a stand to sign up new members, displays as part of presentations, and of course it's also available digitally. So people are putting it on their websites. Startups are putting this on their website. So the impact that we have, when we walk into our co-op, like your co-op, has a direct influence on the growth of the sector. And this is just one tangible example of that, of your co-op supporting this publication, which is now going on to support other communities, which is going on to support farmers and food makers and community health and well-being. And so the ripple effect is strong. One of the photos I included in the publication is a photo I took at your co-op because I was really inspired by your bulletin board. And so I included it in the publication to really show, the difference, a co-op is in a community. And that title, This Is Our Community, I think was really effective. And so this is now being shared with startups across the country to inspire them. And so in this last just section of my talk, I just want to share a bit of a counter to all of this exciting growth and evolution that's happening within food co-ops, because our success as a food co-op sector has also come back a bit to bite us, to haunt us. So here we have the success of seeing an organic sign in a Walmart, which 15 years ago you never would have imagined you would see. And sure enough, the success of co-ops and what we've done has now made it so that we are competing directly with some of the largest grocers in the world. And so some of what is embedded in this too is not just a success story, but it's a story of manipulation, because here we see this sign that says organic, when in fact, when I walked into this store, it was just this one small section of organic underneath that sign. In fact, everything else here in this section was conventional. And so there are some genuine efforts, of course, for the system to change. That's true. And there's also these efforts to use these terms, use this language to really manipulate the customer. And so in this case, I shared this image before. In fact, there was nothing here that was local. So again, the big grocers are getting into this, but how much integrity are they bringing is another question. Putting a sign local prepared right here. These are all foods that are cut and prepared in the back of the store, and they're using the language of local to market that. Same thing at this Walmart. I showed this image before. There were only 2 products in this whole section that were from North Carolina. And the Safeway here in my community is using a flyer that says look for local and attaching that idea of local to being from anywhere within Canada, right? So there's a question of integrity around how the big grocers are marketing their products. And this has an impact on us as co-ops because not every consumer is as aware to question and be critical of what they're reading. In this case, Safeway here is saying look for local, but expanding it to all of Western Canada on the display. And same with this sign that I shared earlier. There weren't any peaches from this farm in the store at that time. One of the slides that I used to share, and I put it in here just for obvious reasons. This was a slide I would share on my talk after I first saw this sign, because it was when I was in Colorado, where Lucky's Market were originated. I was in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I was at the food co-op there, Mountain Avenue Market, formerly the Fort Collins Food Co-op. And I remember driving a few blocks away and passing by this Lucky's Market sign, which I had never walked into a Lucky's Market. I drove by the sign and I saw, wow, they're claiming 99% of their product is organic. And that blew me away because even co-ops can't claim that, very few co-ops at least. And so I was inspired to walk in and I noticed when I walked in, I'm like, wait a minute, no, this is not a 99% organic store. And sure enough, it was only when I went on the website that I noticed that in the small text was organic for the 99%. And so, this is one of many examples of some of the integrity that's coming into the marketing of local, the marketing of organic. And, this other initiative I mentioned earlier of reusable packaging, this also speaks to the importance of scale. So, the only reason Loblaw, Canada's largest grocer, can work with manufacturers in order to create these really, I think, innovative ideas of working with a manufacturer to create reusable packaging. They're only able to do that because of the scale that they have grown into. And so, this is something I think co-ops are recognizing, like certainly our co-op has recognized, is as we grow and increase the amount of scale we're operating at, we can start to maneuver ourselves to try out these, more innovative ideas like Loblaw. And certainly I'm not hoping or thinking any co-op's going to get anywhere near that size. And that's not happening, thankfully. So again, we are up against some of the biggest grocers in the country who are carrying a lot of the same products that used to be distinctly co-op. And we are now also up against specifically natural food chains, natural grocers being one of the biggest. These are some smaller Canadian ones, all of which have been Farm Boy, Choices, Nature's Fair. These have all been purchased by the largest grocery chains in Canada. The language like Heirloom Market, which is being used by Giant, which is another large grocer in the East. And the other piece that is really important, I think, to be aware of as we imagine the future of co-ops and the challenges co-ops might be facing is the homogenizing and the concentrating of the distribution channels that co-ops rely upon. It used to be that co-ops would depend on a diversity of distributors. Often co-ops would own the distributors that they were relying upon. Companies like UNFI came in and acquired a lot of those distributors, as did KeHE. And today, co-ops are very much reliant on one of these 2 natural food distributors for most of those long distance foods. And this is something that co-ops have responded to. in particular through the formation of National Co-op Grocers, which is now owned by 148 co-ops, that consolidates the buying power of all of those co-ops to engage with companies like UNFI and KeHE from a more powerful position. So that's an absolutely essential role that NCG, National Co-op Grocers, now plays. And there's also a vulnerability to that. We've now seen in the past year and a half this incredible vulnerability of our supply chains. And part of it has been through this lack of diversity in the supply chain. And so, to me, when I think of the future of our food co-ops, certainly when I think of the future of my food co-op, the writing on the wall is, for me at least, to see our co-ops as becoming anchor points to, localize our regional supply chains, localize our food system. And, we need powerful grocers to help do that. And so this is the role I see my food co-op playing. It's not a role I think my co-op could have played if we hadn't scaled in the way we did recently. And so this is a conversation our co-op is now having around, trying to detach ourselves as much as we can from some of the more vulnerable supply chains. And so, to me, this is something that co-ops are doing. I shared, the story of Bozeman by, investing as much as they did in that warehouse and their production facility. So these are ways co-ops can respond. And so it's quite similar, when we think of the future of food co-ops, it's quite similar to the era of the early 1980s when co-ops were moving out of that sort of predominantly volunteer-driven phase of the buying club and into opening storefronts and hiring managers and having boards of directors, management teams. It's a similar era I think we're entering into of having to consider, what is the next phase that we as co-ops are moving into, and how are we going to adapt to some of the changes I just shared. And thankfully, I think some of that answer is to keep doing what we're doing and doing it really well. And, just to share some of the examples as to, why I think it's important for co-ops to scale up their impact. I'll just share, what we were able to do at our co-op. And this is something I've seen at many co-ops, is this reframing of what local means. When we saw what was happening to the definition of local, we started this label, True Local. And this is now on all of our products. And we basically say within 100 miles maximum from the store is local, which is, I know what your co-op defines local as. And so the impact on that is to, of course, change the conversation, give people an idea that there are two different kinds of local, and to also demonstrate, we're keeping $3 million in our local community that our co-op every year is paying. And I think I saw in your annual report, your co-op tracks about $4 million of payments to local producers or sales, one or the other. And the other role, of course, co-ops can be playing, and of course, as we grow and increase our impact, is we have the capacity to also advocate for the smaller food producers that are out there, right? And this is something, we were doing recently for a local dairy. And so, here's just another example too of all the ways in which co-ops are trying to bring and maintain integrity in the food system, through helping define local and communicate local. And, one of the other pieces too around impact is the role that co-ops play in helping keep our food dollars in our community. And so, I encourage people in my community to see all these trucks that are coming in and dropping food off, and to see them, for what they are, which is a truck that's coming in and delivering food. And then when it leaves, it's not leaving empty, it's leaving filled with our community's wealth. And so, as a co-op for us, when we grew, we were able to capture more and more of that wealth that was leaving our community. And of course, we take that wealth and we reinvest it back into our community. And one of the examples I share in my book is what this co-op in Seattle did, where they show that 52.3% of every dollar gets recirculated back into either labor, procurement of product for internal use in the store, procurement of product for resale, and charitable giving. And so, co-ops are anywhere in between this kind of 30% to 50% being recirculated in the community. And so, the beauty of a food co-op is that it can't possibly profit off of its customers. So everything that a co-op earns as profit gets reinvested back into the business. And it can also help cushion the co-op to make decisions like our co-op did, which was to start to pay our staff more of a living wage. And so this is how our co-op took this past year and a half, was to respond to the pandemic rather than with temporary measures, to reward our staff and put every staff member on a path to a living wage by 2024, which is not easy for a grocer to do. Some co-ops have done this already. And this year we won an award that was put out by the Canadian Grocer magazine. And so, this is, again, an example of how, as we grow, we can increase our impact in the community and reinvest that success into people, into our suppliers, and into this other example that co-ops are really well known for, which is back into the nonprofits and community organizations in our community, who generally are receiving, most co-ops like yours and mine, generally receiving anywhere between $100,000 to $250,000 a year from the co-op. So that success reinvested back into all these organizations. So this is really, the excitement that drives me to speak about food co-ops as much as I do, to write a book about food co-ops. Again, the ripple effect of our co-ops is substantial. I hope when you walk into your co-op, that if you're not already, that you kind of remember some of what I shared here around just how much impact that experience of us shopping at a co-op is, because it's not just supporting your community, it's supporting this larger movement that is changing the food system. It really is. It's changing the conversation. It's changing how food is grown. And it's hard to see that, by just walking into a store and walking out, but it's happening, and it's real. And I'll just kind of end on this image here, which is one of my favorite images, I gotta say. I saw a lot of photos of staff at co-ops, and this one really stood out, and happy to share it as part of my slideshow, not just here, but in all the slideshows that I offer. And so with that, I want to thank you for indulging in my passion, and I hope this has stimulated inspiration and ideas and appreciation for your co-op, and also introduce the possibility of asking hard questions about your co-op, because this is part of what keeps co-ops, I think, as important community organizations, is being spaces for healthy dialogue and for embracing the challenges that are coming, because I think we are in the middle of a storm right now that is supply chain related. We are entering into a storm that is climate related, and our co-ops are very much, I think, arcs in a way. That's sort of the Noah's Ark, and we're kind of in this together. And I think more than ever, it's really important for us to support each other and support, in this case, the people who are helping steer the ship of your co-op, because I think there's going to be some more challenging times ahead, and I see that as something we can embrace and navigate and find opportunity and do what we've, as co-ops, been doing for 50 years, which is responding to challenge and changing the conversation. So thanks again, and I'm happy to take questions and any comments if there's time.
So we definitely have time for some questions. If you guys have some and you want to throw them in the chat, I can assist in answering those questions. While we wait to see if anybody else has questions, I actually have one, if I can ask, as you're talking about weathering the storm and kind of the situation we're in the midst of. Can you speak a little bit to what you think the response has been for co-ops differing from the larger corporations when it comes to weathering through the pandemic and kind of just not just treading water, but still making a difference in their community while being able to function as a successful business?
Yeah, well, I've observed no single example that sort of I'm noticing happening at every co-op. I think every co-op I've seen different responses. Like, my co-op, as an example, has focused its attention on staff. That's been kind of the focus for the past year and a half. So that slide I shared, that has been pretty much how our co-op has tried to take advantage of this time. Because as it doesn't come as a surprise, food co-ops, like any grocery store, have been investing considerable energy in just adapting and managing this changing climate that the pandemic's brought, which a lot of it's just the very tangible, hands-on, day-to-day operations of the store, the flow of the store, the facility of the store, and keeping staff safe and customers safe. And so co-ops have had to adapt to different health requirements and such, and food safety requirements. And so that's taken up a lot of energy. And sadly, certainly it's taken away from co-ops being able to focus as much attention perhaps as they used to on some of those values pieces. And yet at the same time, I think it's also because many co-ops have really been financially successful through this pandemic. It's opened up some possibilities for co-ops to really step into strongly. And so, like I say, our co-op has used that as an opportunity to support staff. Other co-ops have used it as an opportunity to open up second stores. Your case in point. And this, like I shared, is something really, really common. And so it's like it's a moment in time that I think co-ops have been able to maneuver. Some co-ops, not every co-op, have been able to maneuver more easily and almost fast track what would have been an inevitability anyway, I think. I haven't seen too much around supply chain work yet. But this is something, like I say, as a conversation I've started to have with my co-op around, how do we use this as a moment where it's going to be a lot easier to initiate innovative ideas for supply chains, because people more than ever before now understand the vulnerabilities of them. So yeah, there's just a few answers to that question.
Awesome, thank you. So just a few thank yous in the chat for you, John, but I don't know that anybody necessarily has any questions. I will say, though, we here at Oriana will be reading through the grocery story book that John wrote. So if you do have any questions that follow up, maybe you'll find some really good answers if you pick up the book and come read it with us. So otherwise, if anybody has no other questions, just like to thank you so much, John, for taking the time to spend with both owners and our leadership today. I think all of us can say that we definitely learned a lot, and we're super grateful for your experiment that you did and putting all of your hard work into visiting all these co-ops and letting us know how everybody's faring.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. And I really wish I could have been there in person, but there's something about not traveling right now that is, I think, more healthy to my conscience, right? Being able to not have to travel in an airplane or vehicle. And, I did a lot of that traveling. So having this opportunity is really nice. And yeah, I wish your co-op a lot of success. And I have a sense I'll be visiting your co-op sometime in the near future.
Excellent. Well, we can't wait to have you back.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And thanks everybody else for joining us tonight.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, thank you.